I want to talk about how the difference in how the New York Times and the Washington Post is covering what's happening in Hong Kong right now. So I don't know if you know what's happening in Hong Kong, but what it seems like is that the capitalist class and is hooked up with the CIA and the intelligence community, and they're fomenting discord in Hong Kong, violent, because to keep their capitalism going. Now, I don't know. I don't care how you feel about the protest or how you don't feel about the protest, but the Hong Kong protests are often very violent, and they are. We all know they're being sponsored by the CIA. That's happening. And so here's how they cover it. Here's how the Washington Post covered it. Hong Kong protesters defy police crackdown to resist China's tightening grip. Here's the chaotic scene in Minneapolis after second night of protests over death of George Floyd. And if you read underneath, one person was fatally shot by a pawn shop owner, and looters ransacked the Target, Foot Locker, and nearby small businesses. Blah, blah, blah. The local leaders pleaded for peaceful. So you see how they cover it? Here's another. This is, by the way, I got this from Kiao Collective. It says, this is how the Washington Post describes the Hong Kong. Here's another one. Today, the New York Times ran the Hong Kong protests as their top front page story, calling for U.S. action on China to protect the democracy protesters. In contrast, the article on George Floyd protests was buried further down and said the protesters had turned destructive. So that's just part of how the mainstream news media has covered what's been going on. And what, Chris, what do you think the difference is? Why the disparity in the coverage of those two protests?
Well, because, whether consciously or unconsciously within the media, and we're talking about people who carry out virtually the same kind of activity, there are people who are, good victims and bad victims, if we can put it that way. So, for instance, when I covered the conflicts in Central America, I was in El Salvador for 5 years, you had U.S.-backed regimes killing Catholic priests. And this was during the Reagan administration. The press and everyone else just looked the other way, or they engaged in a kind of character assassination of those religious because they were leftists or they were linked to the FMLN rebels or whatever, whether it was true or untrue, I don't know. But then at the same time, you had this Polish priest who was killed by the communists, and this guy was deified within the press. Now, so it was exactly the same incident, but it was in two different contexts. So I think that's what you're seeing.
Hey, this is the part where I tell you where our live shows are, but there aren't any. And then I would tell you to go join our premium, but nobody has a fucking job. So why don't you just enjoy the video?